Welcome, everybody. We're just waiting for the rest of the crowd to show up.
I think the numbers are stabilized, so we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon or good night, depending on where in the world you are logging in to this University of Maine AI webinar, also co-sponsored by IEEE main section. It's our great pleasure today to have Professor Johnny Polito from New Media Program here at the University of Maine, and also the director of the Digital Curation Graduate Program, and to walk us through the topic of today, Honey AI Shrunk the Archive. So as you know, the UMaine AI webinar series are broadcasted all over the world. So we publicize this in US, Europe, Asia, and in 4 different entrepreneurial regions in the world. Today, our chat is also open. So I let John to walk you through the whole process, but we have a very exciting topic today here, and I'm happy to be here with you all. And my name is Ali Obedi. I'm the chair of the UMaine AI Steering Committee. And with that, I will hand the podium to John to get us started.
Thanks, Ali. Welcome, everybody. I'm hoping we have a fair amount of interaction today. I'm going to present some provocative ideas and look forward to hearing some dissent or questions or other commentary in the chat. We don't have an official Q&A because we're just trying to keep the comments flowing. So feel free to have a conversation in the back channel over there. And Mindy and I will and Ali will look at that periodically and pull out some questions throughout the conversation. So don't feel like you have to wait to the end to ask a question. The talk is called Honey, AI Shrunk the Archive, and asks what value it is to look at AI not through the lens of animistic metaphors, but through actually somewhat machine-like metaphors. And I'll explain why I think that helps us understand the benefit and threat to our standards of knowledge as embodied in things like archival and museum collections. So you can start by doing just scanning the QR code that's right there in the front slide. Might be easiest to do with your phone if you're on Zoom on a desktop, because that way you can fill it out while you're watching the presentation. But I'll also put a link to a survey that I'm going to put in the chat here. Bada boom. Okay, so this is just a few kind of basic tasks that you might think about doing with AI and how appropriate you think it is technically and ethically to accomplish them. So if I go to, I'm going to leave this screen up for a moment while people are filtering in, but essentially this just, naive, anonymous sense of how well AI is going to do at these. And you can kind of imagine that you're working with, a kind of current level of a transformer model, something like ChatGPT, Claude, or Gemini. Also assume that these models do not know anything about you beforehand, that they have not been custom trained, but are simply off-the-shelf models like you might find at chatgpt.com and so forth. Okay, and let's see, I assume some people are filling this out. Let's take a look. So interesting. Okay, so we have so far, summarizing a meeting is the one that has the most sort of votes in sense of favorability. Almost 3/4 of people or 2/3 of people are saying that's acceptable. Second, distant second is commenting on an essay, although that's getting a little higher now, I guess. The horse race is continuing. Representing you at the meeting is pretty low. That's like 20%, or no, I guess 10%, of respondents think that's cool. And grading an essay is a little bit better, but still, around 20% approval rating. We have, let's see, about 21 people responding, and there's 40 people in the chat. So if you want to reply to this, please go ahead and click on the link in the chat. It says this is linked to the task parameters Menti survey. That's the one we're looking at here. Or if you still have the initial screen, you can click on that QR code. That might be easier if you're on a phone. You just scan that QR code right here on the right-hand side and use that to access the link directly on your phone right here. Okay. And let's see where we are here. I got about 25 people responding so far. So no right answers, just taking the temperature here. And so far, summarizing meeting, I mean, I guess maybe people have seen that so far. They might have like hit the OK button when they join a Zoom meeting. So they're familiar with Zoom note takers or, note takers for other video conferencing software. And there's some reluctance about that, right? It's like 70% approval. Commenting on an essay is next, and then grading and representing you at a meeting are kind of far behind. And then we have a comment, I obviously will get into more detail, but my goal in this conversation, my goal in this presentation today is to kind of get you to think a little more technically about what models are capable of doing and under what circumstances tasks might be appropriate or not. And we'll revisit this sort of survey a little bit later. Okay, so my name's John Ippolito, and I am organizing a couple webinars this week. Yesterday, we had one from Sarah and Ben Brumfield, very interesting, a couple who work on applying AI to archives. Their talk was super pragmatic. Mine is going to be a little bit more blue sky and delve into everything from Roman history to thermodynamics. So if you're looking for something more like, hey, I just want to apply, apply metadata to images or extract entities from text, this is a great webinar. I'll have a version of it online by next week for sure. Today's talk, in addition to UMaine AI and IEEE, is brought to you by Learn with AI. This is UMaine's program to help anyone, understand either from the teacher perspective, from the creator perspective, from the student perspective, how to work with generative AI in and outside of the classroom. You can find lots of resources at learnwithai.org. One of the things we've created is a sort of acronym to help remember the downsides of AI, because we'll be talking a lot about AI today, and I won't mention every single thing that is bad about it, although I think they need to be mentioned. So at AIRisk.com, you can find, AIimpactrisk.com, you can find resources to help you remember these or to incorporate them into quizzes and videos and slides like this. But basically, it's an acronym to remember the usual things that many people have thought of, like, maybe tainted data being, biased, or the opportunity for plagiarism, but also things maybe you haven't thought of, like monopoly or the injustice of having workers in Kenya work for $1 an hour to label, grotesque or disturbing content. But today's focus is really on AI's impact on archives and how mechanistic models or analogs can help us understand what that could be. So there was a big change in scholarship and access to ground truth, whether it's, kind of, I don't know, writing about, Milton or bioinformatic data on genes in the, 90s when things started to get digitized. And no longer did you go to the library to find things. Increasingly, you looked at databases. So a scholar named Lev Banovich wrote a well-known sort of essay saying that this changed the paradigm of scholarship. Well, now we have an even bigger change, I would argue, on the horizon, thanks to AI. You have to remember that stuff doesn't just appear in archives, it gets there somehow. It's typically created outside, right? Painters in their studios making paintings end up eventually, if they're lucky, having a painting join a collection like a museum. Authors in garrets writing novels or books eventually have their book in a library shelf. Scientists who research important data findings may have data enter into archives. So the creation happens outside the archive with some human kind of steward, and then ends up in, if they're lucky, a public collection, again, museum, archive, or library. Well, what happens after AI is the reverse. So we still have that process of creative works going into archives, and those archives increasingly are online, the web archive, Wikipedia, Reddit, and that becomes the fodder, the sort of, fields on which the AI harvesters graze, and they pull down billions of documents or images and then use those as the source for creating works. So this is the archive, as Eric Salvaggio, artist and researcher, calls the AI, the archive in reverse. So instead of creation happening outside and then works of, suitable creative production ending up inside collections, the collection is what you start with, and the robot, the chat, bot, whatever, uses that resources to, or I should say more accurately, the AI company, such as OpenAI or Anthropic, uses those resources to train a chatbot that then spits out the images and the text on the creative side. So it's the reverse of an archive. What does this do to scholarship? What does this do to those of us who care about where knowledge comes from, right? So I'm going to talk about this in 4 steps. First, I'm going to talk about some animistic AI analogs. Apologies for the alliteration there. Things that are lifelike and whether that's a good model for thinking about these generative AI models. Another is mechanistic AI analogs. We don't think about those very often, but I think there's a lot of value in looking at different comparisons to what models do. Then we'll talk about how the mechanistic analogies really change the way we think about these models. And finally, what that does to the archival trajectory. What's it going to do to this kind of evolution of scholarship and the formation of knowledge? So let's get to number 1. Which analog are we going to use? Animistic analogs, well, from the AI boosters, the people are like all gas, no brakes. We're talking about typically an idea of a growing child. Well, AI is still in its infancy, but it's growing quickly. Those metaphors that sound like some cute little robot, or perhaps eventually a super being, pretty soon we'll be up to AGI, and then this being will know everything and will guide us and tell us what to do. Those are all animistic metaphors that suggest some kind of lifelike creature that's very intelligent and possibly very helpful. They're of limited use, I think, because they apply characteristics to the models that aren't necessarily true, and that's whether you're a critic or an advocate. So Emily Bender, a linguist, famously used the term stochastic parrots to describe these models, implying that there's simply some kind of creature that hears something 1,000 times and then repeats variations on it, right? So that they really aren't doing anything creative except regurgitating what has already been heard. That's obviously a term tends to be negative. It's used by critics of AI, saying like, well, they can't do anything new. They're simply reproducing the data that's out there, including all the biases and so forth. I think both of these are problematic, and I'm going to try to explain why. First off, there's a very big difference between life forms and models when it comes to homogeneity. Now, we think about complexity and we look at a diagram like the one on the left. We say that's extremely complex, right? This is only a 2-layer or a 3-layer neural network. And already it's got, hundreds of different connections, edges, we call them, between the nodes. And it just looks like a big pile of spaghetti. And we say, well, this is super complex. Like, how could we understand that? But that's complexity with homogeneity. Compare that to, a cell. A cell has all these super complex little organelles. It's got endoplasmic reticulum and mitochondria and nucleus and so forth. It's got a lot more different parts and different kinds of parts. So I don't think, the kind of complexity of a neural network, even when you scale up the one on the left to, billions of parameters, as contemporary models have, approaching 1 trillion parameters, it still is kind of like just a giant bowl of spaghetti, as opposed to the differentiated kind of structure that we see on the right. And that's at many different levels of biology, right? So yes, you have the cell, electron transport chains, super complicated process with all these chemicals. On a higher level, you have like how, insulated is regulated in the blood with different enzymes. On a higher level, you have like the complexity and nuance of, Italian gestures, right? So life takes a much more heterogeneous format. So I think that's one difference. Another difference is how they're trained. This is interesting. Research by Linda Smith started at Indiana University, essentially strapping cameras to the heads of babies. It took a while to get the babies to be happy about it. Apparently, they found something better than a GoPro, but you effectively have all this footage of babies crawling around and whatever they do in their day. And it turns out that it's not what you'd expect. It's not like pictures, mostly images of their mother looking down on them or some kind of book that they're reading. It's mostly like fuzzy pieces of carpet and people's knees, and maybe every once in a while the family dog. So what's surprising about this is that babies are able to take this crappy footage. I'm using that word metaphorically, like whatever they're receiving in their retinas and their eyes, and turn it into a remarkably robust learning system where they might only see ever one dog in their life, and somehow they're able to identify new dogs that they see when they're going out in their stroller and say, oh, look, a dog. That's in contrast to, large, well, most AI systems, even pre-transformer, where they need, thousands or millions of examples of pictures of dogs in order to identify correctly a new dog. So that's kind of surprising, right? That like humans are able to sort of generate knowledge and understanding from such small amounts of data. On the flip side, the idea that these are large language models, and if you just kind of put enough, language in them, so billions of documents, you'll be able to simulate language, and language is effectively intelligence. So a large language model is also a large thought model. Well, that sort of research has been debunked by fMRI scans. They're kind of brain scans that, in this case, by Eve Fedorenko at MIT, who studies the way that language is processed in the brain. And, it's not definitive because we're doing these kind of scans. We don't really know what's going on with the brain. But as I understand it, the research is very clear that when you are engaging in linguistic activities, you're forming sentences, you're reading, there are very specific parts of the brain that light up. They might be different for different people, but they're always the same. And when you do other tasks, other kind of thinking tasks like adding numbers, different parts of the brain light up, not the ones that are associated with language. So maybe language isn't the engine of thought. So what does that do to the whole premise of large language models? Well, if they are doing some kind of thinking, it's not the kind of thinking humans do. So this is research that suggests that, maybe the animistic analogs aren't even correct on a technical level, leaving out all the sort of metaphoric issues involved. Let's talk about mechanistic analogs then. What's going on there? How could we see other options? Well, these models aren't like living beings walking around. They're bits of silicon and wire soldered together, right? So they're machines. So what if we looked at like super simple machines and asked to what extent they mimic those sorts of properties? So the idea of a compression algorithm is an interesting analog. Ted Chiang in the New Yorker described ChatGPT as a blurry JPEG of the web. Like you took all of the online resources that are out there and sort of compressed them into some kind of a miniature version that then you could share. And so the idea that these are actually tools for taking knowledge and compressing them down. So, for example, GPT-3, which is back when OpenAI was actually open and shared a lot of data, so we can use the kind of parameters and counts from those. It has a compression ratio, if you count the number of documents it ingested in training, of about 2,000 to 1, meaning it kind of can spit out, it can sort of represent in the number of parameters how many, kind of how much information is in the model itself. 2,000 times that much data in terms of raw documents, which is pretty cool, right? Because you basically have this thing that's like, 2 gigabytes. It's like the size of, I don't know, Call of Duty or, a game that you could download, a very long film, and it represents the entire internet. So that's cool, but it also, if we look deeper into it, suggests some questions about what the limitations of compression are. So JPEG's probably the one we're most familiar with, right? It's like you take an image, if you're a camera aficionado, there's raw images that have every pixel, and then there's JPEGs which sort of smooth them out. They make it shorter, essentially by saying like, if you have a sunset and it goes from, I don't know, red to yellow, well, instead of picking all the little blips, all the little pixels in between, you could just write a little formula that said, go gradually from red through, orange to yellow, according to a formula. And so it'll condense all those pixels in between by an interpolation of what it expects them to have been if they were an even gradient. That's cool. Your photographs no longer take 100 megabytes each. Now they're like 5 or 10 megabytes on your hard drive or your camera, your phone. Very handy. But if there's something anomalous in that sunset, like maybe a little picture of a bird in the background or something, it might have treated that as kind of an error and just wiped over it. And that sort of smoothing over of anomalies is a real problem with compression algorithms. Obviously, it depends on how good they are. On the lower right-hand side, you can see like this is pretty crappy JPEG at 45 to 1 compression. So there's a lot of nuances of this woman's face that are being disregarded. as you get better, you end up with better quality, but you still have sort of places where the original, defects or particularities of the skin are just gone. What's really bizarre is that this is not just a metaphor, this is actually a fact. And one of the best ways of showing it is that you can use a compression algorithm that was made for that purpose as a model, as a large language model. It's kind of insane. So here's an example of a compression algorithm. It's not JPEG, it's something called gzip, but gzip is everywhere. You don't realize it, but it's all around. It's what compresses things that come from websites when they go through the internet to get to your browser and appear on your screen. They use gzip. It's used in your hard drive to manage files and so forth. It's a really remarkably ubiquitous product. It would be like saying, I don't know, shoes. Every time you see a shoe, that's about how often you actually encounter gzip without knowing it. So it's this kind of, everyday wash day variety compression algorithm. So some researchers tried applying it to actually classify text, and it did an amazingly good job. In fact, it beat Google's own transformer model from 2018 at the time. This is a little older story. But combined with another small utility, it beat that at text classification. That's insane. That's like saying, I don't know, your John Deere tractor beat a race car, and makes you think, well, maybe they actually have the same kind of engine underneath. So compression algorithms are close to AI in a way we might not recognize. So that makes us start to think about, well, with compression, if you're losing outliers, if you're smoothing over in the anomalies, if that's the way compression works, maybe we should be worried about the way that AI can smooth over anomalies that might appear in the archive. Unusual text, unusual examples, people who aren't part of the mainstream culture. Those are all things that might not appear in a very compressed version of the internet. Another analogy, though, the second one I'll give you is even more ubiquitous, perhaps, and that's just a cup of coffee. And I don't mean to be flippant here. I'm looking at a coffee as a thermodynamic system. And there's lots of reasons why I believe thermodynamics are a great way to think about AI. But although they can sound very abstract and mathematical, really a cup of coffee has almost all of them. It has energy, which is, how sort of fast the molecules are moving around inside the coffee. It has entropy, which is how much the coffee is sort of dispersed. If you poured milk into it, how much has that become an even system as opposed to the initial blop of the macchiato, the little blip of milk in your coffee. And it has temperature. And these properties turn out to be really important for tuning AI models. And we'll see why in a moment. So this is the probability of molecule energies. Throwing a little math at you here, don't worry. It's basically an equation saying that, depending on how hot the coffee is, or really any liquid or gas near equilibrium. So it sort of applies to a whole lot of stuff, a balloon, an ideal gas, lots of cases in which there's movable molecules, right, bouncing around, and minimal interaction between the molecules. So you've got a situation where the probability is determined by this formula. Well, without going into details, this is the probability of a word generated by ChatGPT or any other large language model that uses this so-called softmax function. They look kind of similar, right? There's a couple little slightly different letters. There's a couple little negatives here and there. But essentially, it's a very similar looking probability, one determining how many molecules there are at given speeds in a cup of coffee, and the other determining the likelihood of a word appearing in the final result of a prompt. So if you prompt for, let's say, once upon a time there was a blank, there's a series of different words that will come as a result, right? So in theory, when a model is, before it's trained, it could be any word in the English language or other languages. But after you train it, there's going to be a certain list of most probable words. Those are called logits. So for example, once upon a time there was a princess, might be the most common. Maybe there's like a 30% chance of that being the next word, according to the training of in the original corpus. Maybe, you know, king or queen is like, you know, 20% or 15% or 5%. You go way down the list, there's going to be like, I don't know, donut. Once upon a time, there was a donut. That's going to be like 0.001%, right? Very unlikely to be the next word in sequence. So when you hear people say, oh, you know, these models are just word predictions, that's how the words are being predicted. They look at correlations. It's a, you know, complicated. Transformers look at like the relationships between words in the prompt, but effectively it's one word at a time being constructed based on the probability the word will be there. Well, even though these models have some different characters, the formulas have the same letter in each in a very similar place, namely T. T stands for temperature. And temperature is a property of both your cup of coffee and any ideal gas or liquid and a large language model. What does it mean? Well, we know what it means in coffee. If you start with some milk in your coffee, and if it's a high temperature, it's going to mix around the milk in the rest of the coffee and kind of disperse it, right? If it's a low temperature, then the milk might stay where it is. The temperature is a way of kind of infusing, kind of increasing the movement of molecules. So probabilities spread more generously when temperature is high. Same idea with language models. The probabilities of the next word spread more generously, meaning that words that might have been a little lower down on the list are more likely to appear than they would have if they were at a low temperature. So yes, princess is still going to be the highest, but now maybe it's only 10%. And maybe king and queen are like 5%. And maybe donut is actually, I don't know, 0.01% or something higher. Like you're more likely to get more creative, unusual results. That's what the softmax function does. And that's what that temperature setting does. Now, you don't see this in a ChatGPT sort of oracular interface. And you also don't see it in, when you're, using Grammarly or something. But if you kind of install your own like local language model, like an open source model, or if you use a sophisticated image generator, you'll see temperature is a gauge that you can set. It goes from 0 to 2. And if you put it at 2, you're going to get crazy wild results because it's allowing to sample through all the possible words. And if you set it down to 0, you're going to get what we call a degenerate condition, which is only the most probable. So every single time it's going to say, once upon a time, there was a princess. And the next time you generate it, it's going to be once upon a time, there was a princess, and so on. So obviously, that's not very creative. We often want something to be more interesting as a result if we're writing a story. But if we're asking for the capital of France, we might want something that's lower temperature. So this is, I think, a very important concept. And most people don't realize that these things can be tuned, and the same model can give you very different behavior depending on these parameters. So what do we conclude from these mechanistic analogs? First, just ask if anyone has questions, clarifying or other, ideas about this. Throw them in the chat if you do.
John, there is a couple questions in the Q&A, I think.
Oh, so there is a Q&A. Sorry, go for it.
So the first one, I think, is saying that you're talking about 2000 to 1 compression for ChatGPT version 3. How accurate it is retrieve original data and interpret information?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it looks like there's a follow-up talking about language and not pictures. So accuracy is kind of a tricky thing to describe. I don't know, because there's so many different tasks and different sort of measures of accuracy. I would sort of probably point you toward the public benchmarks for results that are out there, but remembering that the benchmarks are very different. They measure different things. So there's something called the AI Arena, which is a very interesting benchmark used for everything from text to audio to images to video. And what it does is it presents two models results next to each other, but you don't know which model generated the same for the same prompt, and you just choose which one is the better one. And it uses crowdsourcing of the public to decide. So you might say, well, that sounds really accurate, and it's using a lot of people, so it gets a lot of different tests. But on the other hand, you're letting the lay public decide what's accurate. So, that has a problem for facts. It also has a problem for visuals where, they may always choose an attractive looking or a stereotypical looking person in response to a prompt, as opposed to something that represents the diversity of human experience. On the other hand, there are much more cut and dried benchmarks like, can you solve the advent of code number 23, which is like, solve this problem in Python and make sure that, you end up drawing a ball bouncing around inside a moving hexagon or something. And then you can either see like, oh, it did draw it or it didn't. So I can't say offhand the accuracy, but because of their different measures of it, but what I can say is qualities like temperature and energy, which can be controlled both in the energy in the training and entropy, temperature in the inference side, will affect the result. We'll see why a little later. And then saying whether a human has to make a decision versus believing completely in ChatGPT. Yes, I would totally agree with that statement.
And John, there is also a question in the chat. I would be curious to know what you think about the use of term hallucinations in relation to generative AI outputs.
That's a great question, Rosa. I hate it. It is another term that suggests the sort of human-like or embodied knowledge. When I see a pink elephant, behind me looking around, there isn't really a pink elephant there. I can guarantee you that. It is an error in the connection between my senses and my brain, right? So I am imagining something in my embodied space that isn't there due to a psychic problem, right? It's a clinical condition that is abnormal for human thought. And it comes from our experience of the embodied world, and it is a inaccurate sort of mirage from that world. But large language models aren't embodied. They don't have bodies. Maybe a Roomba could walk around, bounce into things and have an experience of the world because it has a body, but large language models like ChatGPT don't. The other thing that I find extremely problematic is the idea that, well, it's an error. It's a malfunction. It's a clinical condition. It's a psychosis. No, in humans it is, but for large language models, it's how they build everything, right? So if you ask if you say, what is the female version of king, you're very likely to get queen. If you say, what is the female version of donut? Well, that's ridiculous. There is no correct answer. But if you prompt ChatGPT long enough, it will give you a suggestion for what that is. If you ask, what is the connection between Taylor Swift and quantum entanglement? It will tell you if you prompt it. And it's not that there is one, it's just that it is generating new data, not by going and looking up something in an archive, but having digested the archive and compressed it by spitting out something that it thinks is kind of in the same space, the sort of average of the words in the prompt, if you will. So if you think about the JPEG as connecting between the red and the yellow and sort of making an orange in between there, whether there was an orange in the original picture or not, that's what ChatGPT does every time it gives you the answer to a prompt. So when we say hallucination, we're basically implying that sometimes it doesn't hallucinate. No, it always hallucinates, and sometimes it's true, and sometimes it's false, because the average of two facts isn't necessarily a fact. Let's see. Other people hate it too. Okay, good. There's lots of other metaphors you'll hear people use, language like, the AI understands or AI has learned, or, and then there's other words that are, you hear about interpretability. Can we interpret what the, language model is doing to try to figure out how it's thinking? And I think that research is really fascinating. But, I wish instead of the word interpretability, they use the word accountability, because then that would mean like, you told someone to eat rocks, you're accountable as an AI company for building a system that does that. Okay. Maybe I'll go on then. Yeah, let's see. So Ruther said, instead of spitting a wrong answer, why not say, I do not know, or spit out low probability? Very, very interesting question. Turns out to be very hard to do. It's hard to train these models to know what they don't know. because again, they're not going most of the time, unless you use retrieval augmented generation, they're not going back to an archive to look in the shelves like you or I might. Oh, let's look up the citation. That's why citations are so terrible with many of these generators. So instead, Anthropic just came out with a paper like earlier this month or last month, I guess now, on trying to figure out how models justify their answers. And it turns out they set Claude so that by default it doesn't know, and it's supposed to say I don't know the answer, but if it has sufficient occurrences of the words in your prompt in its data set, it will overwrite that and say, oh, I do know. And it just almost never goes back and says I don't know. It'll always say I do know. It's very rare that it will do the other behavior. So that's actually built into the system. Confabulation. Yeah, I understand the idea of confabulation is another word that people use to describe hallucination. I actually prefer the term fabrication because it's what it does all the time. It's always fabricating. Whether it's a lie or truth, it's constructing it or reconstructing it, if you will, not going and searching for it in a database. Okay.
And just to continue, one other comments I want to make kind of in regarding the analogy you talked about. I mean, if you think about what we perceive from the world around us, right, with our eyes and ears and other senses, the entire world around us is analog in the sense that there is infinite number of points we need to store to fully capture the videos and pictures and sounds. The reason we were able to move into the area of like MP3 and JPEG and MPEG-4 and all that is that because we understood how to sample the world around us to create a digital bunch of numbers, right? And the sampling to us, it looks like lossless. It looks like we can actually perceive the entire world around us in terms of the sounds and sights and everything. But in reality, we are reducing the infinite number of points in our world into a finite number of values that we store in a digital format. So that was like the first step. Then the next step after that was that now, how do you really reduce the number of those digital numbers into much, much smaller numbers? Like for those of us who remember like old times, we used to have like a CD, audio CD that can only hold like 1 hour of music. And then suddenly MP3 came out and then you could have like 14 hours of music on the same medium, same number. So one way to look into that, and I'm trying to kind of relate it to the concept of thermodynamic and entropy from information theoretical definition of entropy is that the probabilities of events will tell us how often they appear in our dictionary, in our context. So if you don't care about the probability and you have, let's say, 100 numbers to store, you allocate 8-bit or 16-bit to each number, you end up with 1,600 points to store. But if you think about a book, a text, an essay or something, and say, I parse that, and the probability of having the word is, am, are, or the, or that is much higher. So maybe I should allocate fewer number of bits to those, and then allocate larger number of bits to words that are appearing less often. So that kind of was the basis for creation of zip and JPEG and all that. So I'm thinking of this is the way you put it for AI is very interesting. I don't think we are there yet with AI. I think we are past the digitization process. We are past the probability estimation process, but maybe there is like one more layer we haven't done for AI going forward. So I really like the way you put this analogy because we can learn from all the steps that has happened in information theory to get us from analog phones into digital compressed, phones. And maybe if we think about it a little bit harder, we can do the same for AI. I just want to kind of put this out there for people to think about. So
I think that's a great point. And I think the history of this sort of challenge that you gave of how can we compress things the most intelligently to get the least loss, right? Could be mapped onto the history of like recent changes. Like in a sense, all of the twists and turns, the transformer model is, more or less stable. People are adding, tricks and twists on top of it, chain of thought, retrieval augmented generation. And we can think of a lot of this as ways of sort of just doing a better compression, getting better, kind of results, like you said. Love to talk about that more if there's time. There's another question about, check out the calibration error, how confident AI was in its response on humanity's last exam. Oh, that's a great example, Phil. Yeah. There's a link that Phil's added. Copying AI also extends to the often unethical production processes. I hadn't thought about that, but yes, fair trade. I don't know if there's any fair trade AI yet. So that's actually a really good point. Even though I'm deliberately steering away from like, oh, it could burn you or whatever. But yeah, no, there's definitely some political overtones to these analogies as well. Let me talk about some of the more sort of cut and dried conclusions, though, and things specifically targeted, like, okay, this sounds very good in theory, John, but what does this mean about how I would use this in practice? So, before training, you have these nuances, right? And after training, the nuances pretty much, we try to keep them there, but there are some that are lost. And this is very easy to see if you ask ChatGPT, for example, about a fact for which there's a lot of, misinformation online, unless it has been essentially fine-tuned by researchers on that specific point, it's liable to reproduce the misinformation and the bias as opposed to the more, kind of nuanced detail. If you ask it about what Neil Armstrong said on the moon, most people actually get that wrong. It's going to give you the wrong answer. And that's a sort of consequence of that smoothing behavior, right, of compression. In a sense, yeah, so I'm sort of mixing the compression and the thermodynamic metaphor here, but remember that essentially a thermodynamic system is one in which there is a constraint to get to the lowest possible energy. And that constraint tends to smooth things out. That's why we say entropy increases. In fact, in a sense, a compression algorithm, the goal is to get it to be, so you have zero energy, zero temperature, and every time you get exactly the same picture out of, say, a JPEG. Whereas with generative AI, we actually want some temperature. We want some heat to the system so that we can actually get new creative results when we ask it to create poetry or, new picture or something. But on the other hand, if we're asking for the capital of France, we probably don't want that level of temperature. So again, these are parameters that need to be tuned, and you need to be careful about how you choose when to use it and which model to use. There's a lot of confusion about probability, and I think that this will help us, thinking about these systems and understanding these kind of riddles or surprises of probability will help us understand why sometimes these models seem like super big-brained and sometimes they seem super pea-brained. So let me just explain one of them with the help of Roman history. So the chance of your next breath containing a molecule of Julius Caesar's dying breath is 98%. Now that seems absolutely absurd. I can go through the math, but I'm going to explain it with a little diagram here. So let's suppose this up here is like, the entire atmosphere, this grid, and one lungful, and I'm simplifying obviously, is this little square up here. So Julius Caesar dies, and he has a couple, let's say he only breathes out like 2 molecules, making an extreme to make a point here. So this is his lungful. His dying lungful is like these 2 molecules, right? And then you're way over here on the other side of the world a long time later. What's the chance you're going to breathe in one of those? Well, almost nothing, right? Because like those molecules are going to be distributed somewhere in the world, and you're just not going to breathe them with your next breath. So this would be a case where there's few molecules per breath compared to the number of lungfuls in the atmosphere. But what if we switch that around? What if we go to the other extreme, where there's a whole lot of molecules per breath relative to the number of lungfuls in the atmosphere? Now you might say, well, John, there's a crazy number of lungfuls in the atmosphere. Yeah, but it turns out there's more lungfuls in or molecules in a lungful by several orders of magnitude. What that means is that there are so many of these green dots in this little square, the lungful that, was Caesar's dying breath, that with sufficient mixing, we're assuming that it takes a while and the atmosphere kind of mixes around, then you are almost certainly likely to get one of those little green dots in your square when you take your next breath. So this is a really shocking statistic when you see, but I'm hoping that I'm trying to help explain it in this kind of sort of, diagram showing that if there's a lot of possible correct answers, then they tend to spread out sufficiently so that you're likely to sample one of them. What does that have to do with large language models? Well, let me explain. A snapshot, I'm going to call a sampling of possible solutions. And you can have a whole lot of good ones in there, or you can have very few good ones in there. Whenever we prompt AI for an answer, we're essentially taking a sample from the total possible answers that that model can give us. So in the example of Julius Caesar, that would be a lungful, right? Our lungful is like a sample of the atmosphere. What else we got? Well, we got density. We can describe the kind of thermodynamic properties in this region of space by how dense the useful answers are there, right? So is it very dense? There's a lot of good answers in that place, or is it sparse? Well, there's not many good answers and they're kind of spread around. That would be like having Caesar's atoms near your lungs or far from your lungs. And then temperature. Temperature is the variety of possible answers. How much is the air moving around? That can be hot or cold, obviously. And that's how much mixing there is in the atmosphere. So if I look then and apply that to large language models and when I should use them, I really want a Caesar scenario, okay? Whether I'm talking about like getting a correct answer or getting a creative answer, either way, I really kind of want to pull the needle out of the haystack of all the crazy possibilities that the model has given me. So the two prerequisites are I got to have high density. I've got to have a lot of good possible solutions relative to the number in my snapshot. And I've got to get decently high temperature because I've got to have the attempted solutions varying with the snapshot. So those are two ways I could get that sort of Caesar scenario. What does this mean for large language models? Well, if I combine these two properties, the density and the temperature, if the density is sparse, meaning that I don't have a lot of molecules near where I am, but the temperature is high enough that they've mixed around, I'm likely to get some of those Caesar molecules in my breath. So if I'm looking for something that has a lot of possible solutions and I have a model with a high temperature, I could actually get some of those solutions in my sample. Again, a prompt is like a sample. Of course, if it's a lot of good solutions and it's also hot, that works. There's a chance I'll get a bad one, but I'll probably get a good solution. If it's dense and cold, well, then I'm almost certainly getting a good solution because I'm right next to where Caesar died. Basically, I'm breathing in his lungful because his atoms are very dense in the area of where I'm taking the snapshot. But if it's sparse and cold, that is, there isn't a lot of density where I'm taking the snapshot, and there isn't a lot of variety, temperature, I'm going to get a terrible result. There's almost no likelihood I'm going to get a correct solution. So if I were to map solutions or I should say problems that I'm asking AI to solve into this space, it might look something like this. This is a horrible, horrible example of AI gone wrong. This is called obituary spam. And it's when someone dies, people just generate AI obituaries for links, basically SEO kind of scams. And they're based on whatever information the model happens to have about people. And of course, if it's, a famous celebrity, it might actually get it right. But what they do is they generate these for random people who, grew up in, my town of Springfield, Ohio, or something like that, and we're a butcher. And so relatives find out these, they look up and they find these obituaries online. They're full of either generalities or incorrect results. And so they're like, this is terrible. This is not what, Henry was like when he was alive. There have been some cases, even when they're generated by people who are still alive, which is pretty bad. But it's because there isn't enough density. These are not celebrities. These are people whose lives aren't present in the data. And so you've got what we call data voids, a situation where it's going to make up that middle orange color between the red and yellow. Another example is that temperature could be too low, right? So density could be too low, temperature could be too low. When you're doing analysis of scans like X-rays for determining lung cancer, you actually don't want your temperature to be very cold. You think, well, this is a case where you want to be right. Well, no, actually, your goal is potentially identifying things that could be cancerous, potential tumors, anomalies. So you want to cast a wide net. You essentially want to get a lot of different answers, not just the most probable ones. And so if you have the temperature too low, you get poor results. That's a case where you actually want high temperature. It's also possible to have the temperature too high. So if your goal is to help you, create a court case that you're going to, submit, as part of a brief to the judge, you don't want to just make up court cases, right? It's okay if you see something that could be cancerous and turns out not to be. It's not okay if you tell a judge, well, this certain case proves my point, and then the case doesn't exist. So it depends very much on the type of task, and we might graph these tasks by these two parameters, sort of thermodynamic parameters, right? So temperature, hot at the top and cold at the bottom, versus how much data is there in the prompt? Is it dense? Is there good data close to the snapshot, the prompt that you're giving? Or is it sparse data like, no, it's not going to found that on the internet. There just aren't enough examples in the training data. So what I'd like to do next is to have you do a different little task here. And this is very short, just a couple of questions. How, instead of asking you whether you would do it or not, it's asking you, do you think the data is dense there or not? So I'm talking about, if you link to that, and I'll also put a link in the chat, you'll get the survey here. It's talking about, again, commenting on an essay, grading an essay, but now it's asking about the data. Is there a lot of density? How much variability correlated to temperature is okay? Is it okay to have a lot of variability, or is there only one right answer? And you can either scan that and do it from your phone, or I will post a link to it in the chat for people who want to just see it there. And I'm really curious to see how this comes out. Okay. So either way, I'll be very interested to see what the results are of that. Again, don't assume that it has special information on you, right? Assume that it's essentially using what it can as a large language model, not that you've like fine-tuned it for your own, I don't know, attitude or purposes or a student's progress. I've given you two tasks that are sort of like education oriented, and two that are just sort of general oriented. Perplexity is a lower temperature. I would guess that, but I've also seen perplexity generate spurious citations, and perplexity is supposed to draw on more credible sources. In other words, it has a smaller sort of data set than ChatGPT. It weights things like Wikipedia and sort of some proprietary academic databases higher, but it still will fabricate nonsense sometimes. All right, let's see if we got some results here. We got 4. Let's see if we can do better than 4. So again, you can either use your phone and scan the QR, or you can just click on the link in the chat. All right, we got 9. Let's see if we can just do a little bit better. While those are coming in, what I'm going to do is to try to graph your results according to this picture that I made here and see where we end up. So let me see if I can do that. And responses. Okay, that's interesting. All right, I'm going to stop there, I think. I'll just create a spreadsheet. I'm going to do this with ChatGPT, basically to try to generate a very fast results. I don't really want it in the form of a table. Okay, so what I'm going to do is take the data that you guys came up with, and you know what, maybe I'll download it as tab separated values. Okay, and then I'm going to go over to ChatGPT and I'm going to say, please, I will upload a file of tab separated values with the results of a survey. Please render it as JSON, which is a JavaScript format that I'm going to use to make a table or your graph using the following template. And no, that's not what I want. I'm going to grab some. I've already have this sort of sample code that I'm giving it. Shift, boom, shift, dot, dot, dot. And we'll see how it does. Maybe it'll blow up and, not work. But I'm going to try uploading the file we just found that you guys generated. Here. Okay, this should happen pretty fast because this is just, I'm literally just asking it to turn a Google Sheet into JavaScript that I can put into a little bit of a graphing function here. I don't want it as Python. No, because it's showing me what it's doing. That's what I get for using 4.0. Okay, so this is basically turning the data that was in the in your answer, your survey. But that's not enough. I want all of it. Partial preview. Show the entire file, not just the partial preview. Just want to make sure it's formatted correctly. Okay, well, here it has download. I don't want to download it. Just show the file here in the chat. All right, here we go. This is what I want. So because this is pretty cut and dried, I'm not worried about it generating incorrect results. It could, I don't know for sure whether it will or not, but the goal is to see if it will, if I can very quickly use it to modify the data. That looks like about the right amount. Let's see, I'm going to copy the code. I've already made a graphing function. I actually used ChatGPT to help me code this. It's using a system called P5.js, which is a very fast, a very easy kind of web JavaScript-based framework. And this is what it came up with. Okay. I don't know why I did that, but so this is interesting. If I look at the results, did that zoom in? Can you see that zoomed in, Ollie, on the screen?
No, I just see it like
No, it sees the
parts
same
of
thing.
the
Okay,
screen.
so let me increase the size of my browser here, window here. Let's look at full. To look at it in the full version, full screen. There we go. Okay. Okay, so that should look bigger, right?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So what we're looking at here are the results that you guys gave us, and obviously to had more examples, I could kind of identify this more clearly. But if I say commenting on an essay, most people, with some exceptions, saw that as sort of hot, meaning that it's good to have a variety. So a hot model would be helpful. I would totally agree with that. I think that having different perspectives on someone's writing is actually a very valuable use case for AI. It's interesting that it's sort of like in the middle of the road. In other words, people feel like, well, you don't have to have like super dense information. Like maybe you don't have to have that much, like maybe track data about the student, that particular student's writing in the data set. But obviously you don't want it too sparse. So I would pretty much agree with this, and I'd say you could probably get away with having fairly sparse data and having useful examples, because essentially you're asking to give new perspectives, new commentary, new feedback. On the other hand, when we look at grading an essay, we get a very different result, with some people thinking that it would be okay to be moderately, I don't know, medium heat or whatever, but most people saying cold. You would want to have the right answer, and you would want it to be dense. You want to have a lot of information, but unfortunately, chances are you're not going to have many. So it's one of the ones where it's kind of middle of the road, but biased a bit toward maybe this lower end of the graph. If we look at summarizing a meeting, that's kind of all over the place, honestly. People seem to feel differently about that. Some people feel like it'd be good to have some heat to it. Some people know, I'd say majority of people would rather have like a less creative responses, if you will, and so a lower temperature model. And there's a huge range of thinking about whether it would have to have information about the meeting already in the data, or whether you could just go by a sparse model that already, just kind of doesn't have any special training. And then when it comes to representing you at the meeting, well, that's pretty much down here. Like, people do not want AI to vote for them. It seems like there's unlikely to be data about how you'd really feel, like what you'd actually think should be done. And also, you wouldn't want it to just kind of be flippant and have a lot of variety of creative answers up here in heat. You'd want it to have sort of cold responses that are more likely to give you the most probable answer, right? You don't want to say, well, let's flip a coin and vote that way. I'd say that kind of makes sense. So just to sort of skip to the chase here, this allows us to think about the kinds of models that we might want to have, kinds of uses we might want to put different tasks to. Creative, brainstorming and so forth. Hot with dense kind of parameters makes sense. Brainstorming out of the box or edgy music or something, hot, sparse model might be fine. Summarizing a meeting and writing code, we probably want it to be on the colder side. And then there are things for which we should never use AI, in my opinion, and that's when the data is sparse and it's cold, like prescribing drugs, representing you at the meeting probably, or grading an essay. So I could talk about more, but I know we're at time, and so I'm happy to talk about other questions.
Thank you, John. I know the time was short. We wish we had more time to hear more about this exciting way of looking at AI. And I just want to thank everyone for attending today. Thank you for speaking today. And also thank our sponsors, UMaine AI, Learning with AI, New Media Department, IEEE, etc. And looking forward to more excitement in this area. So thanks very much, everyone. Thank you, John, again.
Thanks, everyone.